not much for a community speaker, so I have to, look at notes, but, so anyways.
Yeah.
Our mission is to protect water and marine life. We started in 2018 when that big red tide hit. I'm sure all of you remember that. So we formed this group, and we organized an event. A lot of us stood out along the shoreline, held hands to bring awareness to the devastating effects that this red tide took on us and our ecosystem. So we were many communities around the coastline. Can't remember the exact. Samantha normally does the introduction, so she.
33 locations, almost 10,000 people.
33 locations around Florida. So yeah, it was really a cool thing. So I'm just up here to introduce our speakers.
Before you do, can we get in touch with you?
Yeah, handsalongthewater.com, or you can look us up on Facebook at Hands Along the Water. We'll have other presentations, and we do. We're out there in the community doing cleanups.
Yeah, well, I saw you at the South Venice.
Yeah. We're going to have John Thaxton up here, as well as Steve Suau. John Thaxton began his environmental advocacy at Venice High School in '74 as a founding member of the Ecology Club. John is a fifth-generation Floridian and is recognized throughout Florida as a leading advocate for protecting the natural environment. John joined the Gulf Coast Community Foundation in 2012 and is now the Senior Vice President. So he formulated this community playbook for clean water. He'll get more involved with that later. And then Steve Suau is a professional engineer with more than 35 years experience in both the private and public sectors in Southwest Florida. He is currently principal of Progressive Water Resources, LLC. Mr. Suau formerly served as director of Sarasota County Stormwater Program and has assisted in the envisioning and technical guidance on the regional watershed restoration projects such as Celery Fields, Donna Bay, and Tatum Sawgrass. I really like his recent work on biochar. I'm sure he'll maybe get into a little bit of that. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up John Thaxton to speak first.
Thank you. I can stand here, it's better, right? Can you hear me in the back? Kendra? Kendra? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background. First, a little bit about me. As was announced, I am a fifth-generation Sarasota. I have been here. My family came here in somewhere between '87 and '89. Obviously, 1887, 89. And I grew up on a family farm in central Sarasota County, part of Palmer Ranch. Maybe some of you might be acquainted with a restaurant in that vicinity called Rossler's Restaurant. So if you're familiar with that restaurant, you're familiar with my childhood home. If you've eaten in the Bijou there, which is a fancy name for a bar, you've eaten in my family room, and if you dined in the dining room, you were eating in my living room at the time. So I grew up there with a very close affinity to the hinterlands. I would hunt dove, quail, and turkey to the east, and I would hang out with all the commercial fishermen in the bay. And I can remember probably no more than 12 or 13 years of age hanging out at the fish houses around Vamo and Osprey and Nokomis. And the fishermen, during the times of these harmful red tide outbreaks, would complain, and they would suggest, and this is 1968, 69, and they would suggest then, in language I cannot repeat today, but they would suggest then that the development, or this they would not use the term altered landscapes or human-changed landscapes. They would just call it, the development coming in and replacing all of these pine flatwoods. They call them piney woods. With subdivisions and shopping malls and asphalt was contributing to these red tide outbreaks. So as a child, I never forgot that, and it's kind of stuck with me all of these years. So long story short, I went to Osprey Elementary School, which is now the Spanish Point Visitor Center, and then Venice, it was called Junior High School then, and Venice High School, and was motivated by a high school biology teacher and a high school marine ecology teacher, Bill Wimbish and Charlie Powell, respective, and became just totally motivated about protecting Sarasota County's natural resources. So here I am today. I'm 62 years of age, and I still have the same passion about doing this work. So when I came to work at the Gulf Coast Community Foundation, they wanted to, they were just coming out of this crisis, the economic recession, where the not-for-profit agencies in Sarasota County were greatly impacted by the economic recession. And so a lot of their resources were moved into this area of human services. And as we worked our way out of the recession and things got a little bit better for some of our not-for-profits and they were more stable, the board said, we need to do something about the environment, and then the red tide outbreak hit. So now I'm the senior vice president, I'm in charge of grants and programming and all that, and they said, John, go do something about this. And so I said, sure. And so I had always had this focus on water quality, and I called my very good friend, longtime friend, Steve Suau, and I have been working together for about 33 years on particularly surface water qualities in Sarasota County. We were kind of the inspiration of the county's stormwater environmental utilities program and other things. That's not as important as I knew him to be a very talented person with regards to stormwater. So I recruited him, and also two other individuals that I knew very well, Jennifer and Dave Schaefer from Schaefer Consulting. They kind of head up the Sarasota Environmental Council of Southwest Florida. Did I get it right this time? All right. I messed it up the last 5 times. And I said, I want you to help me with this concept. And I had this idea about this playbook, right? This guide that if a community were to adopt the activities in this playbook, that conceivably this community, especially one like Sarasota that has already had this background of environmental lands acquisition and fertilizer ordinances and golf course ordinances and neighborhood environmental programs and on and on and on and on. So we had this amazing foundation that we could build on. And I thought if we could use that as a launching pad and then take it to the next level with Steve, Jennifer, and Dave and a group of other experts, which should be maybe on the second slide. Maybe if we could put all of these resources together and come up with this playbook, we might be able to move the needle in a significant way that would cause Sarasota County to become the model community with regards to nutrient management in the state of Florida. So it sounds like an overly aspirational goal, but when you think about the background that I just described and the decades of work that have been already undertaken by this community, its citizens, its elected officials, even its government staff, it's really not that difficult of a task to attain, or at least so I thought. That was 247 pages ago. But one of the things that we wanted to be cautious of, and this will be the last thought that I'll share with you until I bring up Steve, because Steve is really the heart and the soul of this presentation, right? I have no expertise in anything. I just find smart people and I steal their ideas and then I sell them. That's always been my role. I don't think it's a bad role. But that's kind of what I do. But one of the things that we have been always very careful about is this concept of overpromising, right? So we got into this, my board got into this, and others got into this with this backdrop of red tide. Everybody was looking for this magic dust solution to making sure that red tide never happens again in our community. This playbook is not that formula. The chances are that if we did everything correctly in this playbook and we restored the nitrogen levels, the nutrient levels in our bays and estuaries, creeks, rivers, and streams to their natural levels, as if humans, at least European humans, were never here, the chances are we're still going to have red tide, right? Because we had red tide before we were here. So it's kind of a leap to think that all of a sudden everything's going to be better. But our thinking is this. We know that these nitrogen sources, with in particular nitrate, which Steve is going to explain in greater detail, we know that they are a primary and desirable food source for this dinoflagellate Karenia Brevis organism. So as this organism finds its way into the waters that are altered by humans with excess nutrients, it's not at all unreasonable to think, and science actually suggests that by restoring the natural nutrient levels in our near shore waters, that the red tide blooms will become less intense, of shorter duration, and of a minimal extent. But that's still not the goal of the playbook. The goal of the playbook is restoring clean, healthy waters to the Sarasota community, both the human community and the natural community. And we think that in and of itself is an admirable goal and something that we should all be striving for, because it is not only the basis of our social community, it is the basis for our health community, and it's the basis for our economic community. So all three of those goals will be attained if we will focus on removing these anthropogenic, these human-based nitrogen, these human-based nutrients from entering our water, and do the best that we can to remove those that are already in it. So with that as an introduction, to kind of give you a background about why we got into this, and I do want to call, because I screwed up. We did this morning at the Sarasota County Commission, and I totally botched it up. Because we have these amazing people in the audience with us. You can see this steering committee group of these remarkably talented individuals that just gave tirelessly of their time. They are totally committed to this process, and they were in the audience today, and I failed to recognize them. I felt like really bad about it. So let's just pretend that they're in the audience today and thank them for their wonderful work. And with that, Steve Suau.
Thank you, John. I think people will probably ask at some point when this playbook might be available to the public. Do you know?
Yeah, let me just do that real quick. So the draft is substantially done. It has taken much longer than I had anticipated, and it's costing more money than I had anticipated, which caused a little bit of consternation with my board of directors, but they're okay because they understand that the finished product is going to be worth the weight in the money. But the playbook is substantially done. It's 240 some odd pages. It's going to be presented in 2.5 different formats. One is your typical hard copy format that everybody gets and then puts on a shelf and never looks at again, right? And then the other one is going to be on a web-based interactive format that will be dynamic. It will be updated, it will be revised as numbers change, as circumstances change, as science changes, as things are accomplished, as things get worse. And so it'll be a community, it'll be in the public domain, a community resource that can be used by individuals, subdivision and condominium owners, bureaucrats, staff, people that regulators, policymakers, elected officials, the whole gamut. So the final draft is basically finished. It will go probably next week to the individual that will do all of the wordsmithing and stuff that the four of us don't do that well. And then from there, we will take it to a professional designer that will craft the framework and the ultimate style, presentation, branding, and all of that as it will appear on the website. And we suspect that'll probably take another 60 days plus.
So there you go. Again, my name is Steve Suau. I've introduced myself as a recovering engineer. If I had to do over again, I think it'd be a biologist or a farmer or both, because it's probably not mutually exclusive. I'm going to give an overview of the playbook and provide some context, and then talk a little bit about, if you want to go to the next slide, talk a little bit about some of the findings. The past year through this project, I've been able to kind of do a deep dive. You'd be surprised, there's a lot of questions that came up with the steering committee about nutrients that we don't know. And so we are able to dig in. There's a lot of really good data here in Sarasota County, and that's maintained by the state that we are able to review. And I think getting this information out to policymakers, to community activists and leaders like yourselves really is one of the key things to making sure a community is aware and has the knowledge that, frankly, I don't know if like the Blue-Green Algae Task Force that's been meeting understands as deeply as some of the stuff that we've been able to uncover. So if you could click on, this is a slide of limits that are acceptable for nitrogen and phosphorus. Those are the two nutrients of typically of concern. And the state's law for nutrients is basically they can't be to a level that it causes the natural flora and fauna or the biology to be affected. So nutrients are really a surrogate for healthy waters and biology. We use those, and as long as they're considered to be below certain limits in fresh waters and estuaries, typically the biology is healthy. But at the end of the day, it's all about the biology. So if you could click on the next slide. Is there a control that I could be doing that way you don't have to? Thanks. So nature is not really very tolerant at high nutrient levels. There is something called, that we'll talk a little bit more about, advanced wastewater treatment. That's wastewater that has been treated to a high degree for nutrient reduction. And those nutrient concentrations are still above the natural systems. Let me see if I can, there's a pointer here. Okay, maybe there's not. So, estuary limit, freshwater limit, advanced wastewater treatment for nitrogen, phosphorus, and then what's called secondary wastewater effluent. So not all wastewater is created equal. When you hear it's treated, that doesn't necessarily mean it's treated for nutrients. It means it's treated for pathogens and bacteria, public health, welfare, and safety. The concern with nutrients is as they increase in the estuary can transform. Things start to happen. We typically, whether it's Sarasota Bay or Charlotte Harbor or Tampa Bay or even the Indian River Lagoon, use seagrass coverage as the indicator of whether the bay is healthy or not. What can happen as nutrients increase is that seagrass can start transitioning. We start to get macroalgae that has a lot of nutrients in it. That starts to block out sunlight. Over in the Indian River Lagoon, this happened on a big scale. And they had a hard freeze and some rain, and that macroalgae released all its nutrients and turned the estuary into phytoplankton and brown algae, and it devastated the estuary. They don't know if they're ever going to get it back to what it used to be. This is concerning because we're starting to see in some of our bays here macroalgae mats in the estuaries and the bays. So there's a lot of concerns about that with the estuary programs that we're starting to look at. Relative to algae blooms, in the simplest form, there's 5 things that are needed as a recipe, if you will, for algae to form. And the first 4 of these, we really can't do much about here. We're in a warm climate, we're in the sunshine state, the micro-constituents of trace elements are available, and phosphorus, which is unique to this area. You go outside of this geological area on this other side of the ridge of Florida, and it's completely different. But here, we have a lot of naturally high phosphorus in our soils. It's because of the geology. That's why Mosaic is up in Polk County mining it, because it's almost at the surface. The environment in this area has adapted over the eons to all that phosphorus. What we're The ingredient that if we add that causes problems then is nitrogen. Everything else is relatively fixed, but nitrogen is not. So the more nitrogen we add, that's the magic ingredient that causes a lot of our problems with algae blooms. And last year, it was discovered by Sarasota County that over the past 20 years, nitrogen levels have been gradually increasing in Sarasota Bay. I think this graph was actually presented by Brian to the County Commission last year, and I think that was the first time they saw it. But this has become pretty much a classic graphic that Sarasota Bay is using. And if you remember from the previous graphic, or a couple back, the more nitrogen in the bay, the more we start to see things happening where seagrass becomes transitioned out. I looked at Lemon Bay data, and it looks almost identical. So this is a trend that we're seeing kind of along the area. And the state, we're hearing that the state of Florida is going to designate most of our bays as impaired either at the end of this year or early next year because of this issue. So we need to address nitrogen, not so much phosphorus. And what are the sources of that nitrogen? Well, they're mainly, what's causing the problem are mainly man-made sources of the nitrogen. When we talk about nitrogen, it can consist in various different forms, but the form that's the most related to our footprint is nitrate. Nitrate is a form of nitrogen that's instant food. Plants and algae, it goes right to them to grow. Organic nitrogen has to be broken down, and it can be, but nitrate is instant food. And the sources of this nitrogen that are typically have the nitrate in it are wastewater, whether it be spills or even reuse irrigation can have high nitrogen concentrations in it that we put on golf courses and landscapes. Septic systems are pretty good at processing nitrogen to the point of nitrate, so their contribution is also nitrate in the leachate. Runoff from agriculture related to fertilizer and urban runoff, again, is typically in the form of nitrate, and atmospheric deposition from rainfall and dustfall. We'll talk about that a little bit too. So those are kind of the anthropogenic forms of nitrogen that we looked at in the playbook. And so to understand nitrogen, the problems it causes, and how to solve them, this is probably the most important thing to understand. We talked to the county commission about this afternoon, like John said. Their staff has been talking to them. Sooner or later, when this sinks in, everything becomes a little bit clearer. So what happens is, nitrogen is the most common element in the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is naturally nitrogen. We're breathing it now. But it's very stable in the atmosphere. However, there are bacteria in soil and water that can pull that out of the atmosphere and fix it. And then it's available. They can make it available for plants and animals to use. Because there's other bacteria that then can convert the ammonia nitrogen into nitrite and nitrate that for plants and animals to use. And then there's a third type of natural bacteria that can convert that nitrate back into the inert gas and complete the nitrogen cycle and put it back into the air. So like the hydrologic cycle that we all know about water, there's also a similar natural cycle that has been happening for eons, forever, of how nature processes nitrogen. The key is this bacteria that's able to process nitrogen through this whole cycle, and the key to that is to have healthy soil. You can't, it's very difficult if you don't have organic soil for this bacteria to be able to even exist. Okay. One of the things we did, and I don't know if this has not been done before, we've shared this with the estuary program and the county and SwiftMud, but what we saw was we had, Sarasota County is really fortunate to have collected a lot of historical data. They probably need to manage it, this is a constructive criticism, manage it more thoroughly and use it to see what it's telling them. But what we looked at was a watershed that was a fairly urban watershed, Whitaker Bayou, kind of in the city of Sarasota area. And then we looked at a very rural watershed on the other side of the spectrum called Deer Prairie Creek that's a tributary to the Mayaca River that's almost all under public ownership. So it's truly not just a rural watershed, but it's a pretty natural watershed. And what we are interested in is within the total nitrogen that was being measured every year, how much of that was this nitrate? And was there a difference between the rural and urban? watersheds. And what we found was that in the Whitaker Bayou, on average, and it was pretty consistent, the reason that these bars change so much is because the pounds are related to how much runoff, which is related to how much rainfall. So it's very dynamic because of rainfall, but the nitrogen concentrations and the percent that's this nitrate is pretty consistent at about 28% for Whitaker Bayou, but only about 5% for Deer Prairie Slough. So this is saying not only should we be managing nitrogen in our region, but we should be managing nitrate in particular, okay? So a little bit about the playbook. The purpose is to focus, prioritize, and coordinate community activities and philanthropy to accomplish water quality improvements in the Sarasota County region. It's intended to augment existing plans that the estuaries and the counties have in the Water Management District. The vision that waters will meet their designated human uses for drinking, shell harvesting, and swimming and fishing while sustaining healthy natural ecosystems that support natural processes and resilient native plant and animal communities. This is pretty much what the Florida water law looks at for class waters. The target of the playbook will be to utilize, will be for it to be utilized by municipal, county, and state governments and agencies. We've along the way met a lot with like the Water Management District, who's been very supportive, and the Department of Environmental Protection at the state level, as well as the National Estuary Programs. But this could also, is intended to be used by foundations, by businesses, by homeowners, and other civic groups to help prioritize and coordinate funding activities. The goals are basically to reduce anthropogenic nitrogen, remove excess anthropogenic nutrients, and sustain the systems once that's done. The playbook is divided up into, I believe it's 42 different activities that can be implemented at various scales. They have to do with looking at how to reduce the sources, how to look at things like land conservation, species restoration, green infrastructure, and stormwater BMPs to remove the nutrients, and to sustain education, incentives, partnerships, better data, and public policy. These are the chapters of the playbook, and like I said, there's 42 activities within it. We're going to talk a little bit about these this evening, probably some more than others. And the first one is fertilizer. Okay, so Sarasota County, thanks to John Thaxton, years ago was one of the first, if not the first, county in the state of Florida to adopt a fertilizer ordinance. All of the cities within the county have adopted essentially the same ordinance. The city of Venice, city of Northport, city of Sarasota. So wherever you live in the Sarasota County region, the fertilizer ordinance is essentially the same. And with respect to nitrogen, it basically limits the amount of nitrogen that can be applied to 4 pounds per 1,000 square feet per year. So what we looked at was, how are we doing? We were able to get fertilizer sales records from the Florida Department of Agriculture and Community Services for they give, they're not that easy to get, but we were able to get it because they do, it is by county. So we got sales records for fertilizer in Sarasota County, and it was about 5 million pounds a year. You can see there. And then we looked at this large green area is actually the area of Sarasota County, 61% that is native landscapes, agriculture that's pasture or improved pasture, area that is not really eligible to even receive fertilizer. Of the remaining 39%, 15% of the total is impervious surfaces, so that shouldn't get fertilizer either. So that leaves about 25% of the overall landscape that's even eligible to get fertilizer. So what we looked at is if you took that 5 million pounds of nitrogen and you applied that at 4 pounds per acre, how much of that 25% remaining is actually getting fertilized to the prescriptive amount? And it's only that 7% of the total, so about a third of that land. What that probably means is there's a lot of people that aren't fertilizing in some of the more rural counties, or I know in my community, South Venice, and areas probably in Northport, a lot of that demographic probably doesn't use fertilizer. It's probably a lot of the communities that have irrigation systems. So I think this also is indicating that the fertilizer